Hello and welcome to Fire Away, Rudner Law's online Q&A show focused on the employment law issues that matter to you. My name is Stuart Rudner. I'm an employment lawyer and mediator and your host of Fire Away. As you know, Fire Away streams online every month and episodes are always available on our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, and our website. If you are watching live, we'd be happy to answer your questions, so feel free to either post comments on Facebook or YouTube or tweet to @RudnerLaw. Our guest today is Derek Hill of Hill Kindy Practice Sales. Derek is a chartered accountant and a real estate and business broker who started his career as a partner in a public accounting firm. And for the last 35 years, Derek has been providing management, consulting, and practice brokerage services exclusively to the healthcare community. Derek, thank you so much for joining me today.
Stuart, thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
Really glad to have you, Derek. And as you know, myself and the team here at Rudner Law have been spending a lot of time working with dentists, with healthcare professionals, especially over the last couple of years. And as things often happen, this was not something that was really planned. But many years ago, I was telling you before the show started, talking with someone at a social event who happened to be a dentist. And he was, once he knew I was an employment lawyer, the floodgates opened. And he started to talk about all of the issues he was having with his staff. And we were able to help him with a bunch of those issues and eventually help him to sell his practice, which I know is something we're going to be talking about today as well. But it's become a core focus of our practice here at Rudner Law, is working with dentists in particular and healthcare professionals more generally to run their practice, and ultimately other buying and selling practices has become a big part of our practice. So let me start off with a really hard question for you. Maybe you can tell me a bit more about what Hill Kindy does and how you guys help people.
Well, absolutely, Stuart. Thanks. We're primarily in the brokerage business. We have been in the consulting business, so we've been in the business totally probably for 35, 40 years. And we're part of a larger umbrella organization wherein we have a full consulting team. We have a team that does associate recruitment and placement. We do lease negotiations. We have a couple of brokerages actually across Canada, and we're just started a new project in consolidating individual dental practices for uses in corporate dentistry. So we've kind of got fingers in a lot of pies. Interestingly enough, as it pertains to what we're talking about today, we do a fair bit of seminar work and just did a big symposium on corporate dentistry about 2 weeks ago.
Right.
And we asked everybody before the symposium what keeps them up at night. And interestingly, the resounding answer was staff problems, keeping my staff. And I think the second one was associate problems. And so, you know, what you're doing fits really well with what most of the dentists out there see as a huge problem.
Yeah, I'm always kind of scared to ask a dentist where their pain points are, because that just makes people very afraid. But you're right. This is what I'm hearing. It's associates, it's staff. And, you know, most of the time we have dentists, and the ones I work with, they are great at what they do, but they often don't have the time to manage their office, to manage their staff, to deal with the associates. So they often either ignore it or they pawn off those issues on an office manager or someone else. But it, you know, often just ends up snowballing. And that's when we come in and we help them deal with those issues. And hopefully, and what I find, generally speaking, whether it's a dentist or a doctor or any other business, usually we end up coming in when there is a problem and we help them to solve the problem. And then when that's all taken care of, we can step back and debrief and assess how we could have avoided or at least minimize the damage. And that's when we start doing the more proactive work, like the contracts and the policies and that kind of thing. But I'm curious, if we talked about the symposium and what people were saying, curious as to know what more specifically you're seeing as far as staffing issues that dentists are encountering.
Well, one of the biggest issues that we see, and it does relate to selling practices, and that's the whole issue of whether employees have contracts or not. I would guess probably 70% of practices do not have employment contracts. And so that creates a fair bit of difficulty when the dentist goes to sell his practice, because in many cases, some of these staff members have been there for a long time. And so they're bringing with them a pretty significant severance liability. And so there's been different ways that the legal profession has dealt with this over the years. Not too long ago, the norm was fire everybody. And so the new guy starts with a fresh slate. That got pretty expensive. So now we see situations where maybe for the first 3 to 6 months, the parties agree that if they have to terminate somebody, they'll split the cost 50-50. But that whole process is made so much easier if a practice has employment contracts with their staff members, for sure.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm sure you see this.
Oh, I mean, that's been a mantra of mine for probably 15 years now, where I've been telling all of our employer clients and anybody else who will listen to me that you need to have good contracts in place. And you can achieve a lot of things with the contracts, but if there's one thing you want to focus on, it's what you mentioned, severance. And the reality is, I mean, in Canada, if you don't have a contract, then severance is governed by a bunch of factors. You look at the person's length of service, you look at their age, you look at their position, the availability of similar employment. And the common myth out there is a month per year. And our courts have said over and over again that that's not the law, because they're looking at a whole bunch of factors. But it gives you an idea of the type of or the scope we're looking at. And the reality is that we've got an unofficial cap in Canada of 24 months of severance. We are seeing some cases that are breaking through that now, but let's say 24 months is the cap. If, as you said, Derek, you've got a long-term employee who's been there, let's say 25 years, they might be entitled to 2 years of severance if they don't have a good contract. If they have a good contract, that could be as low as 8 weeks. So that's a massive difference. And that's just one benefit of a good contract. So I've been saying that for years. And the other point I want to make, because a lot of times business owners and dentists are no different. They think of this as checkboxes. So do you have a contract? Yes, we do. Do you have policies? Yes, we do. They never take the time to assess whether the contracts are any good. Because over the last 5 years, we've had dozens of cases where people have challenged contracts, challenged termination clauses. And I don't know the exact stats, but I'd say at least half the time, the contracts are found to be not enforceable.
Yeah, actually, you bring up a really good point. And just another point, too, that we find is oftentimes the real pain in severing somebody is not always just in the statutory issues. It's in the common law issues, wrongful dismissal, all that sort of stuff. Those can get extremely expensive. And again, we typically like to see, we tend to start dealing with clients 3 or 4 years in a perfect world before they actually sell their practices. We like to see them get their contracts out of the way early. If somebody comes to us and says, I got to sell in 6 months, I know I'm going to get a contract too. We usually say, well, you might find that that's going to take you longer than 6 months to get that done. So whenever we get a chance, and certainly when we do our seminars, we have a big focus on getting these guys to act on some of that stuff sooner rather than later, for sure. Yeah. Totally for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And but the other point too is, if it's 6 months or a year or even 2 years away, it may not be worth going through the process because the buyer may have their own contracts. And now you're going to have staff. Yeah, staff get really flustered when they just, they feel like they just signed a new contract, and all of a sudden they've got a new buyer, so they're already a little bit wary. They're being asked to sign another new contract. So that's, when I'm acting for the buyer, of course, one of the first things I will ask to see are the contracts in place. But in many cases, I'm actually relatively happy if there aren't any, because we can now put our own in. Yeah,
for sure. And we're actually finding, maybe not so much with employment contracts, but certainly with associate contracts, they get out of date really quickly. Depending on the flavor of the month at CRA. And if they're not carefully drawn, we had a large client about a year ago, probably a dozen practices. And just based on how they had drawn or not updated their associate contracts, CRA decided that there was some HST to be paid somewhere in the mix. So they had to write a check right off for about $100,000. obviously they went to tax court, but in the interim, CRA is also saying, well, we really like the 100 grand you just sent us, but how about installments for this year? So they were a couple hundred grand in the hole before they got it resolved. And it was just really a function of a poorly drawn contract.
That's actually a great example. I mean, that's the one side of it is the whole tax CRA issue. The other and more common aspect is what are your obligations as an employer or as an independent contractor? And of course, most associates are independent contractors. Interestingly, though, I'm not sure what you see. I see a lot of hygienists who are also treated as independent contractors. And the reality is, in my view, if that was ever challenged, they'd be found to be employees.
Yeah, that's a real common myth. And you're absolutely right. I don't think you'd have a leg to stand on with CRA. In fact, we were jointly selling a practice, and there was the dentist and his partner. His partner was an auditor at CRA, and they got talking about just exactly that, hygienist. He said, well, the co-broker would say, well, that shouldn't be a problem because they're independent contractors and yada, yada, yada. And at which point the auditor from CRA said, I don't think so. Not a chance. And so you're absolutely right. There's a big misconception in that area.
Yeah, and along with those misconceptions, there's this common view that, well, if they are incorporated, then they can be independent, or if they've signed off on a contract that says they're independent, they're independent. And the reality is, CRA doesn't care how the parties characterize their relationship. The courts don't care, and there are lots of cases where both sides go before a judge and say, as far as we're concerned, we are completely independent. Judge doesn't care. Judge is going to look at the reality. And if the reality is that the hygienist is working there 5 days a week, they have no opportunity to work anywhere else, they are being given the tools of the trade, they're being directed, they're being reviewed, they're being treated like an employee, they are an employee.
Absolutely.
And there's just this myth out there, this common view that you can somehow skate around that. And what I often tell people is, look, there's a whole bunch of tests. The tests include who owns the tools, whether they have a chance for profit, how much oversight is there. What it comes down to really is, are they in business for themselves, in which case they are an independent contractor, or are they part of your team? And that's actually one of the things that often makes me laugh is the ones, dental practices that are more tech savvy and have a really nice website. And when you click on our team and you see the smiling faces of the quote unquote independent contractors,
yep.
It's very hard to have it both ways.
Well, a lot of them are of the opinion that if I work for 3 or 4 dentists, 2 or 3 dentists, I'm an independent contractor. And as you say, there's a lot of factors that go into that rule. That's really not a major one. I've yet to see a hygienist bring her chair along with her,
Right.
her x-ray machine. So she's definitely not using her own tools. So yeah, it is a problem. And the big problem that we see is there's a reasonable amount of liability that can flow along with that on a practice sale. If we're just, finishing off a sale, or if I'm just the new owner for a couple of years, and I have 3 or 4 hygienists that have, for say 5 or 6 years, have been treating themselves as independent contractors, there have been no withdrawals made, no income tax held back, that can add up to a huge amount of money very quickly.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's a huge potential liability. The other one is, the severance aspect. And the interesting thing here is, if you look at the case law where someone is claimed to be an employee, even though they were treated as a contractor, usually what happens is they're quite happy to be treated as a contractor throughout the relationship because they get the tax deductions,
Yep.
et cetera. But all of a sudden, when the contract is terminated, and instead of getting 6 or 8 or 24 months of severance, they get something like 30 days, all of a sudden they say, wait a minute, if I was an employee, I'd be getting all this. So they go see a lawyer and they make the claim. And the classic case was about 5 years ago now, where there was a lady who was selling new homes and she was treated as a contractor, and I believe it was 18 years. She was paid as an independent contractor. She had her own corporate entity. She even had her own staff. And to me, this was interesting because to me, I think if you get to the point where you've got your own staff, it's going to be a stronger argument to say you're independent. Nevertheless, she claimed to be an employee. She went to court. She won. The company appealed and went to the Court of Appeal of Ontario, who found that when you looked at all the factors, the reality was she only worked for that company. They gave her all of the tools she needed. They directed her as to how to sell, when to sell, how much to sell for. She was in reality part of their team, despite the fact that she had her own staff, that she'd been paid as a contractor for 18 years. She was found to have been an employee, and instead of being able to terminate her on 30 days notice, the company was on the hook for, I believe it was 18 months in that case. So there's another potential liability.
Oh,
and especially
absolutely.
if you're buying a practice, you may be buying that.
And, those are some of the things that come out of the woodwork. And, everybody says, well, I've got an indemnification clause. I'm not too worried. And I always say, well, wait a second. You just gave this guy a whole ton of money. He's now in Bermuda golfing all the time. How are you going to get your money back? It's not always just quite so easy as you might think. We see this even more so with associates. The number of practices that don't have associate agreements, not only just the Revenue Canada issues there, but the issues in terms of, if your associate doesn't have a contract, how are you going to stop him from going down the road, setting up across the street? And we've seen situations where there have been, no associate contracts, and basically associates walk out with 1,500 patients, which could be almost all of the practice, depending. And so, that's really a huge issue.
That's a great point.
Yeah. We had a client a couple years ago. He'd had an associate there for about 15 years, no associate contract. Everybody in the office referred to his patients or the patients that he treated as his patients. The patients thought of them as his patients. We appraised the practice, and if they'd had a contract, the practice would have been, I think we figured about $1.6 million, but virtually no value, given that the dentist could have walked to the office next door, taken half the practice patients. Practice would have been left with all the overhead and half the revenue. So it's a little bit more tricky even than the staff issue.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it's a very different contract. I mean, obviously, this is a lot of what we do. When we're working with our dental clients, we have contracts for staff. We had very different contracts for associates. And they cover things like restrictive covenants, in other words, non-compete or non-solicit. And the interesting thing, again, is a lot of people look at this like, boxes to be checked. So we have a contract, we have a non-compete, we have a non-solicit. The reality is, and this is a surprise to many people, non-competes, generally speaking, are not enforceable. Courts don't like to restrict anybody's ability to earn a living any more than is reasonably necessary. And that becomes a test is this reasonably necessary to protect the business, in this case, the dentist's legitimate business interests? And in most cases, the courts will say, look, we're not going to tell this person they can't work in the industry where they have their training, they have their experience, they have their clients. But, if the reality is that they have the relationship with the patients, we'll give you essentially a head start. That's what a non-solicit is supposed to be. A non-solicit is that for 3 or 6 or 9 months, they will not be allowed to solicit your clients or your patients. You will have the opportunity to solidify that relationship. But after that time passes, it's open season. So you can't stop them from going down the street or next door, as you said, but you can stop them from soliciting your patients for a reasonable period of time. The challenge, as Derek, I'm sure you've seen this, because I know I've seen it, they don't always have to solicit, because what will happen is the patient will call. And now the receptionist says, I'm sorry, Dr. Smith is no longer here. Where is he? Oh, he's nearby. Or maybe they don't say, so you go online and find it. But the patients will often follow them, which is when non-competes might be enforceable. If you can go to a court and say, look, a non-solicit was useless because the patients were going to follow them anyways, then a court will consider enforcing a non-compete as long as it's reasonable. 2 years, 3 years, forget about it. If it's 3 or 6 months, you've got an argument.
Yeah, no, we see this all the time for sure. People have a non-compete and they think they're fine. We actually have a group practice that we've sold a bunch of practices to. They actually get the hygienists in the practices that they're buying, signing non-solicitation agreements before they'll buy. The first time I heard this, I thought, how on earth are you going to get hygienists to sign that for nothing? And they said, well, we pretty much rely on the goodwill of the selling dentist, the vendor, to talk his hygienists into it. And they do. It's not a non-compete, it's a non-solicitation, but they won't buy a practice unless the hygienists agree to that. Because really, the hygienists are as much a part of the goodwill in many practices as is the dentist.
Yeah, if not more so. I would agree with you on that. And it's funny you mentioned they rely upon the goodwill of the dentist. A horror story that I saw a couple of years ago now was sale of a dental practice, older dentist who had his team of, let's say, about 3 associates and about 15 staff. And in that case, they had negotiated or tried to negotiate who might be on the hook for severance costs. But what the buyer did not put into the agreement of purchase and sale, and we weren't involved in that, was anything limiting the current owner or the current dentist from increasing staffing costs while they were still the owner. So what happened is about a month before close, the dentist gave everybody raises. And all of a sudden, the new dentist came in and he had budgeted what his monthly costs were going to be. All of a sudden, they were about 130% of that. And he really had no recourse at all in that case.
Yeah, I've seen that. Actually, we just sold a practice that closed a couple months ago, and that was an issue. Absolutely. Now the vendor said, well, I haven't given my staff raises in a long time, and some of them were going to leave if they didn't get a raise. But the purchaser's saying, well, wait a second, staff costs jumped like 120% of what they were. What's that all about? And those are tricky things. Those are the kind of things that can push a deal off the rails really quick.
Absolutely. And it gets back to one of the points I wanted to make, and we're already about 22 minutes in because, as I said, time flies. Mm-hmm. But this gets back to the point I'm always making to people, which is whether you're buying or selling a practice, you need to be proactive and make sure that you are protected, because there should have been a clause in there that said the seller could not increase salaries, wages, etc., without the buyer being advised or ideally approving of it.
Well, Stuart, you're absolutely right. Just to interject for a second, our nightmare as brokers is when one of the two parties say, oh yeah, I'm going to use my next door neighbor as my lawyer. He's been my good friend for the last 20 years. And you just sort of know this is a recipe for disaster, because there are a lot of unique things that go into the purchase and sale contract of a dental practice. And if you're really not familiar with those, you find yourself in really significant hot water very quickly. And so we always shudder when somebody says, no, I'm going to use my best friend as my lawyer. And it's like, no, please don't do that. And in the long run, it ends up costing them more money anyways.
Well, people live and learn, but I hate to see people learn in that context. But I mean, the reality is, if you're buying or selling a practice, you should have a team and have someone like yourself, Derek. You'd have a very good corporate lawyer who has experience in dental practices, but as well, you want to have a good employment lawyer. And that's what I always tell people is, look, we're not your one-stop shop. We're not going to do the deal. We're not even going to give you the advice that you guys could give. We tend to play a very small role where the client is working with yourself, the client is working with a corporate lawyer, and we're just looking at the employment law issues that can arise. But the worst case is where you don't look at those ahead of time, because I've also seen the situations over and over again where somebody buys a practice and all of a sudden they realize that they don't like or don't want some of the staff. They've now acquired, as you said before, 17 or 20 years of employment service and the severance that goes along with it. They're on the hook for that severance. So like you mentioned this really briefly earlier, but I think we should come back to it. It's very common now to negotiate a window of time whereby the buyer can assess the staff and determine if they're going to keep them. And for a limited period, the seller will be on the hook for part of the severance costs. And I've seen a sliding scale where it'll be, let's say 50-50 for the first 3 months, maybe 70-30 for the next 3 months. You can negotiate whatever is open to negotiation. But the worst thing that people can do is do nothing. And all of a sudden you've got your buyer is on the hook for severance. Or I saw the flip side, and I'm not sure, this doesn't happen often, but I did see this happen where somebody bought, in this case, it wasn't even a dental practice, it was another business. But we had seller who thought they were going to make a tidy profit and essentially retire and live a nice life. And all of a sudden they found out about 2 weeks before close that the buyer was not going to keep any of their staff. They were on the hook for severance. It was going to eat substantially into their profits, but they never put anything in the contract to address that.
Yeah, no, I mean, we see that all the time with we call them non-dental lawyers. You know, lawyers, say, unlike yourself, who've never had any experience with doing dental deals, and can be a very nasty, and the worst, and I've actually had this happen, is when when a dentist decides he's going to be his own lawyer. and those are probably even worse. You get the contracts, which are 15 different fonts, different margins, and we've got a lot of cutting and pasting going on here. And really, I've seen those, and they are just absolutely disasters. Have cost people tons of money and aggravation, and it's just not pleasant.
It gets back to what I often see, and I keep talking about checkboxes. People seem to have it in their mind that, oh, I have to have a contract, but they don't understand why they need to have a contract and what it can mean. And to your point, they cobble something together, and then it costs them a ton of money down the road.
Yep.
Because they didn't bother to do it properly. And often these contracts are either from the States or they're cobbled together from things that are 20 years old or not even dental practices. And I mean, I know you refer to non-dental lawyers, and I probably would have laughed at that about 7 or 8 years ago, because I assumed, HR is HR, employment law is employment law. And like I said, I got, ended up working with a dentist who referred me to other dentists, and now it's a big part of our practice. And I now understand the terminology, and I understand the unique issues that exist. Yeah. And you're right, it's very different than other types of businesses. You need someone who has that expertise.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. No question. We've basically seen 1 or 2 deals fall off the rails because somebody was insistent on using, their next door neighbor. And we've seen it cost people hundreds, quite literally. We had one deal, it was a very large deal, but it cost the guy about $400,000, the seller, just because it wasn't done right. Just crazy.
It is crazy, and the reality is, how much did he sell? How much did he save by not doing it right? 5 or 10,000.
Well, the interesting thing that in this particular case, it was a $9 million practice, which is a pretty large practice, and it wasn't done right, and it cost them $400,000. And it's like, that's a deal that should have cost maybe $30,000-$40,000 in legal fees to do right. Mm-hmm. And because it wasn't done right, it cost him a ton of money.
Right.
Crazy.
No, exactly. There's an old saying of penny wise and pound foolish, and that's a perfect example of it.
Yeah.
And I see it in every industry. It's not just dentists, but there are some unique issues in the dental industry that arise, and a lot of it is, like we've been saying, a lot of the goodwill is with not the dentist, but it's with the hygienists or the staff. So, sometimes it's easier for someone to come in and say, well, I'll just clean house and bring my own staff in. But if you do that, you're often getting rid of half the goodwill at the same time.
Sure. And sometimes it's the personality of a dentist. Whenever I run into a dentist and he says, oh, yeah, I had such a staff problem, they were all disasters, I had to get rid of them all. And you sort of look at the dentist and say, well, maybe this problem wasn't the staff. Maybe the problem was the dentist. But, it happens a lot. And it doesn't need to. That's the whole point.
Well, and it gets back to the planning. This, I know I'm going to have my chance in a couple of minutes to fire away myself. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is being proactive and making sure your interests are covered before the deal is anywhere near closing. Turning your mind to these issues beforehand. A, what's going to happen to the staff, and B, who's going to be on the hook for any costs? Is it the buyer? Is it the seller? Is it some combination of the two? But you've got to turn your mind to it, especially in the context of a dental practice. So,
oh, sure. And Stuart, that's why we like to work with clients minimum of 3 years before they're going to sell, because a lot of the changes that they need to make, particularly if their tax law is involved, it takes a little while for it to percolate through the system and become effective. It's like, like redoing associate agreements or employment contracts or whatever. It's not something that just can happen overnight,
No.
We spend actually a lot of our time, as kind of a phrase that we have is, fix it before you sell it. And we find that oftentimes if these guys will fix their practices, they can sell them for a lot more than what they're worth when they initially bring them to us. But if you're going to the marketplace, you've got awesome associate agreements, awesome employment agreements, you're dealing with a dental lawyer, you're going to get a much better value for your practice than if you don't do any of that stuff and use your next door neighbor.
Oh, for sure. And when we're acting for the buyer, that's, as I said, the first thing I'll look at are the contracts, and then I'll probably look at the policies as well. But as soon as I see good contracts, I'll say, look, this is worth paying a bit of a premium for, because you're going to save money on the back end. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah, totally, for sure. And that goes whether it's the employment law part of the process or whether it's the actual, purchase and sale, structuring. It kind of goes across the whole board. I mean, we often say, you need really an excellent accountant from day one. You might not need a dental lawyer day one, but you certainly need them before, the last day,
Right.
or, before the last year. They need to be in there somewhere for sure. I mean, even just structuring, you'd be amazed at the number of practices that we see that have one professional corporation with 3 or 4 practices in it. It's a nightmare to sell.
Interesting. And that's where you need a corporate lawyer with the expertise to actually put things in place, because you're
Absolutely.
right. Potential buyers are going to look at that. And if they have the choice of that or another practice, then they're just going to go to the other practice.
Yeah.
Anyways, we're after 1 o'clock, so
Okay.
I will wrap it up now. But Derek, thank you. And as we said the other day, I think there's easily enough that we can talk about, do this again. So I'd love to do it again soon. But thank you for taking the time. And just so everyone knows, if you want to learn more about Derek and Hill Kindy, generally it's www.hillkindy, which is KINDY.com. But Derek, thanks again for doing this.
Thanks, Stuart. It's been my pleasure.
All right, and Rob, I guess it's my turn to fire away. Okay, so what I want to talk about is a bit of a follow-up to my discussion with Derek Hill in season 2, episode 9 of Fire Away. This is something that never fails to amaze me, that I watch people that will spend months and months negotiating the sale or the purchase of a business. It might be a dental practice or otherwise, but they will completely ignore the issues that relate to the employees that are already there. So they will spend time, of course, they'll talk about the price, they'll talk about the timing, they'll talk about what happens to the principal. If it's a dental practice, is the selling dentist going to be retiring? Is there going to be a transition period? Are they able to go and compete somewhere else? Is there going to be a restrictive covenant, a non-solicitation clause? They will negotiate all of these terms, but completely ignore the fact that there are, again, I'll use a dental practice setting, there are associates in place, there are hygienists, there are office staff, and they will ignore those issues. And it amazes me how often I get a call either after the deal is already closed or within days of the deal closing to say, oh, we never really looked at the employment law issues, but is there anything we should be aware of? And of course, by then, it's way too late. The reality is I've seen situations where people are rather selling a business, maybe the business they spent their entire career, most of their lives building up. They're finally ready to retire. They're going to sell it. In their minds, they're going to earn enough of a profit to retire and enjoy their retirement. And all of a sudden they find out, perhaps a week before closing, that the buyer doesn't intend to keep any of the staff. Now the vendor, the seller, they're on the hook for severance. And I've seen cases where it has cost the person hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's actually happened to a client I was working with about a year ago. And fortunately, in that case, they came to us, that we weren't involved in negotiating the deal, unfortunately. Fortunately, they came to us before the deal was actually finalized. And we took a look at it and we explained to them that if the buyer in that case didn't keep staff, they were going to lose about 50% of their profit. So in that case, we helped them to renegotiate the deal. I've also seen situations where someone has bought a practice and realized that it was completely overstaffed, and some of the staff were loyal to the old owner, but were not going to do anything to help the new owner. But when they realized that they wanted to get rid of them, they came to us and we explained what the severance costs would be. And they realized that all of a sudden they were going to be in the red for probably the first 2 years of owning the practice. So all of these things could have been avoided if they had worked with either Rudner Law or any employment law firm that understands how these issues work and been proactive about it. When we act for either a buyer or a seller, we make sure the agreement of purchase and sale includes a clear plan. What's going to happen with the employees? Who's going to be on the hook for severance? That's something that's got to be negotiated between the buyer and the seller. And as I talked about with Eric Hill in season 2, episode 9, often there's a window of time, perhaps 3 months, during which the buyer can assess the staff and decide who they might not want to keep. And the seller will be on the hook for part of the severance costs. I've seen sliding scales where after 3 months, but up to 6 months, perhaps the seller is on the hook for less of a percentage. And then after a certain time, of course, the buyer now has a staff and they can do what they want, but they're going to pay the cost of doing that. It's also important to understand the difference between the type of sale. If it's a share purchase, you're essentially buying the company. The employer remains the same, nothing changes, which means if you're the buyer, you're on the hook for everyone's length of service and everyone's seniority and severance, unless you negotiate otherwise. Even if it's an asset purchase, you're generally going to be on the hook for most of the severance unless you negotiate it. The worst thing you can do as a buyer, and unfortunately I see it happen all the time, the worst thing you can do is allow the staff to leave on a Friday afternoon having worked for one owner, come back on Monday and you're now the owner. There's no new contract. And all of a sudden they're your employees with verbal agreements because you haven't put anything in writing. And those verbal agreements are there primarily for the benefit of the employees. And you've now assumed a whole bunch of liabilities that you had no control over. So there should be 2 sets of negotiations when you're buying a business, whether it's a dental practice or anything else. Negotiation between the buyer and seller and between the buyer and the employees. And that's where we come in. We help our clients to negotiate the terms in the agreement of purchase and sale that will protect them. That's either for the buyer or the seller. And then if we're working with the buyer, we will help them to negotiate new contracts with all the employees that will limit as much as possible the new owner's obligations. So that's what we'll do. And if we're working with a seller, again, we'll make sure that if the buyer is not going to keep the staff, they understand what their obligations might be and they budget for it. Because again, selling a business for $2 million might sound great, but if you've got $700,000 in severance costs coming your way, you're not coming out nearly as far ahead as you thought you were. So one thing I've said this to people again, I'm always amazed how people will buy a business, sell a business, and not think about these issues. And I always remind them, this is your business. This is your livelihood. This might be your retirement. You can't leave these things to chance. People often say that people are your greatest resource in a business, which is often true. But as an employment lawyer, what I often say is they're usually your greatest cost and your greatest potential source of liability. So be proactive, work with a lawyer, an employment lawyer who understands these issues, make sure that you're protected. And frankly, that's exactly what we do. And we can make sure that you don't find yourself with unexpected costs, liabilities, or staff that you can't get rid of. So please, if you're buying or selling a business, make sure you think about all of the issues, including the employee issues that will arise. That's all for today. So that's all the time we have for season 2, episode 9 of Fire Away. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Derek Hill, I want to thank very much for joining me for a great conversation all about buying and selling dental practices, which has become a significant part of our practice here at Rudner Law. Our next episode will air on Tuesday, November 19th. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to email us at info@rudnerlaw.ca. Reminder that past episodes can always be found on YouTube, on our website, and on Facebook, and hopefully as well on LinkedIn, which we are now experimenting with, and you should be able to watch Fireway on LinkedIn as well. Please remember to subscribe to our newsletter so you'll get notifications of all of our events. I will invite you to keep in touch with Rudner Law throughout the month. Check out our blog, check out our social media, sign up for our newsletter again. But the usual warning, none of that replaces legal advice. And as I always say, if you think you might need an employment lawyer, you probably do. So feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you. Finally, thanks to Rob, thanks to Rebecca, and to Mark for helping put the show together. Thanks again to Derek. Thanks for tuning in again, and we'll see you soon.